I used to say something, and that's what raised that query. I used to basically say, guys, if you've been with us for 6 months, listening to what we say, paying attention to everything we teach, and nothing's changed in your life, it's possible you could be in the wrong congregation. And a lot of people would say, you don't do that. I said, but it's true. If we can't measure impact, so either A, and this was my argument. I said, look, if everybody is having no impact, then I need to change what I'm teaching. Because then it's obvious everybody is not benefiting from it.
Hello, and welcome to Unlock the Kingdom Within You. This podcast explores the profound truth about what it means to be born into the kingdom, not a religion. On this podcast, we challenge the religious and denominational norms which shackle us from expressing the liberty of Christ by exploring the kingdom, the Ekklesia, and citizenship. If you're born into the kingdom but lost in religion, then this channel is just for you. So thank you for listening, and don't forget to subscribe.
You know, I guess when we began the Cyrus Community and the dynamic we began, I got a lot of interesting advice on not letting people be too free, wanting to know where everybody's at and what they're doing. And I had to say, listen, they aren't accountable to me. They're primarily accountable to what God has placed on them. They're accountable to the word they have received, not, and I don't need to have a checklist on who's done what and who doesn't. But I am grateful when I hear feedback that the things they heard, they were able to walk in and achieve certain things. That's where the joy comes from. Not so much the joy that I said it, because it's not my word. I didn't invent it or create it, but the joy that this word is true in their reality. They were able to pick it up, they were able to walk with it, and they were able to accomplish it. So suddenly it doesn't really matter whether they are part of us or not. You know, and I mean, I used to say something, and that's what raised that query. I used to basically say, guys, if you've been with us for 6 months, listening to what we say, paying attention to everything we teach, and nothing's changed in your life, it's possible you could be in the wrong congregation. And a lot of people would say, you don't do that. I said, but it's true. If we can't measure impact, so either A, and this was my argument. I said, look, if everybody is having no impact, then I need to change what I'm teaching. Because then it's obvious everybody is not benefiting from it. But if various people are benefiting, but a few people don't seem to be going anywhere, and they genuinely say they've been paying attention and trying to do what needs to be done, yes, I believe that there's usually seasons of quietness, but there's usually a level of traction anyway, in spite of those seasons. There's usually a level of traction anyhow, that at least shows you that something's journeying. And the principle was, if you're honest with yourself, maybe we may not be benefiting you. Maybe you should find somewhere else or someone else who truly in this season of your life could give you greater impact. So that became like a model for us in terms of movement. And so what that does to you is basically you're saying, look, when you make that statement, everybody could walk away. And if they do, then it basically means it's true. You really have nothing to say to them.
You know? No, absolutely. And I think that leads on to a really good point, which we've flagged here to discuss with you, which is this idea about the idea of the significant challenges of waking up to the kingdom and navigating from membership to citizenship. And the reason why I say that in particular is because you talked before about with your own experience coming through the charismatic, Pentecostal, the apostolic, originally from the Baptist. And I think one of the things, you know, I've always valued my church experience, for want of a better word. I was born into the context of a Pentecostal church. I grew up within the context of that. Through that, I was introduced to the prophetic and the apostolic. By the time I got into the apostolic, I had kind of realized that this was about not throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
Mm-hmm.
It was about ensuring that you gain value from what's in front of you, that listening to God speaking and the truth that comes through the Holy Spirit, to be able to understand, whilst at the same time not necessarily buying into everything that you're seeing.
Yeah. Yes.
And I think one of the key things, though, however, is with the lights, you mentioned it, with the light switching on about the kingdom, and some people responding to it not from a point of a prophetic base with covenant, but more from a point of an opportunity to leave my pain, to leave my challenges, and even migrating into, hearing about the ecclesia, migrating into it, but still carrying the old there, still carrying that old way of thinking. So I guess one of the things I wanted to flag with you, for us within the context of Restore Citizenship, I always say to people, look, Restore Citizenship is a vision. It's not a ministry. It's not a church. It's not a denomination. It's a vision. It's a vision that you either agree with or you don't agree with. And if you agree with it, then the context is signing up to what you agree with, and agreeing with the manifestation of that within the context of a local area or a region. And so Restore Citizenship is a service and the primary goal is to help serve people move from membership to citizenship. That's it. That's what it's about. Now, the reason why I say that is because within the context of that journey, and for some people not knowing how to differentiate between what they've learned under different movements, what guidance, what challenges have you faced with your community to help people shed the appropriate things that you definitely don't want being carried into the Ekklesia, and ultimately turning that, because at the end of the day, if past movements have ended up carrying on the church, it's because the people carried it in.
Yes.
So what's been your experience, and how have you managed some of that? And I'm not expecting you to have
there's a lot of
it all,
stuff there.
because it's still a journey. But yeah,
it is. I'll say a number of things. First of all, the journey had to be mine before it could be anybody's. And I think one of the most valuable positions that God allowed my wife and I to have is to start by doubting everything that we think we know. That was the first point. And believing that God knows the sincerity of our hearts, that we will not lose the value. But the willingness that I could be holding on to something I believe to be accurate and it is not. And so the first prayer was, Lord, flag stuff for us. And what we did with that is that, to be honest with you, Fred, when I exited what I would call the apostolic and so on, the first journey I did was to actually go sit in a church structure under a prophet. And I had no intention of doing ministry, no intention of anything, just relating afresh. And that still was an apostolic ministry. So there was a level of healing that came with that. But the overtures were still there because it was a church structure.
Yeah.
So in the end, my wife and I had to make the radical decision of walking away. And basically, for lack of a better word, disappear from the church structures completely. And just take a season of walking through and querying stuff and letting God unpack stuff without being part of any ministry structure. In fact, to be honest, at the time that I did that walk away, I had no intention of ever starting a community again. I was clear that I just wanted to be me, Thank God I've got some entrepreneurial background, some business environments. So this was us and God and life. And basically just said, look, I'm not taking a break to come back.
Yeah. It wasn't a sabbatical.
No, it wasn't. It was, I'm walking away, and I want nothing to do with this thing called church. If there's anything else, Lord, you'll tell me, but this I'm not touching. Because I'm not going to be part of something I don't believe in anymore. Neither am I going to cause people to walk in something I don't believe in. And this is not walking away from you, God. This is walking away from the structure. Walking away from that order, because at this point in time, I don't have a design. I don't know what it looks like. To be honest, I had no picture what that looked like. To be absolutely honest, it was just, we walked away. I continued seeking God, praying for what I'm doing in my business and stuff. In that window of time, God began to speak to me. And my wife and I, and one of the things we clearly said to God is that I'll never do church again. Never, ever, ever, ever. I mean, it was, and that was my idea. And it's funny, that window, God has a sense of humor. God said, I agree with you. Because what I also want has nothing to do with church. We still got something to do, but it's not church. And that's when the formation began, in terms of what does that even look like. And that's really, 10, 15 years ago, God had given me prophetic words about being a Cyrus, having the Melchizedek order. And I began to go back, because I have a habit of keeping record. I receive a prophetic word, an authentic prophetic word, I write it down. I actually have a prophetic register. I track the different prophetic words, I pair them, I see the intersections, different prophets saying different things. And like I always share, is that for me it was a merger. Two dynamics stood. So why would God still give me prophetic words about kingdom, yet at the same time there's this merger with economy and business and politics? And so I began to wonder why that was there. But this time I began to look at it without the confines of church. And it became absolutely clearer. The minute church was taken out of the equation, I began to see. And that's when God said to me, I want you to build a community, not a church. And so when I said, God, give me the meaning of the term community. And it's interesting that God said, look, you love research, you love information. Oddly, he told me to study certain communities. One is a Muslim community and how they operate. Another is a Hindu community and how they operate. And I noticed that in their operations, every aspect of life was involved. They had order for every structure. Whether it was economy, whether it was education, whether it was a complete structure of function. And God says, that's what I want developed. I don't want it legislated. I don't want any membership. I only want relationships. And he said, I will bring the people. Don't look for them. You do what I tell you to do, and I will draw the people myself. And I don't want you to get in touch. Fred, I lived in Kenya. I left Kenya, lived in Botswana for 8 years, came back to Kenya, and God said, don't get in touch with any of your friends or networks. I don't want you to restart anything. I'll bring the people to you. And a series of events opened doors. I began to speak at certain places. I began to build what we were building. And suddenly, a community of people began to show up. Somebody had something and told someone. They had something and told someone. And from the word go, we were clear we were not a church. We were clear we were a community, and we had no interest. I said, I have no interest in replicating myself. We don't want any more profound preachers or teachers or people who can do and say what I say. We want people who can do what we say, not say what we say. And so from the word go, we had only this one query that is a common mantra at TCC, the Cyrus Community. What have you heard? What are you going to do about it? That's the ultimate process that we began. And so it became a matter of, we always want to know, what are you doing with what you've heard? Not doing for us, not in our environment, but doing in your life with what you've heard. How are you impacting your environment? And so we've built all sorts of structures around that. Men unusual, women unusual. The whole idea behind all these things is to move away from the church order. Now, you asked a question. Every time people come into those groupings, they bring the old mindset. So it takes a while because they think it's a men's fellowship. They think it's a women's fellowship. The old, we are getting together, we are here to pray. No. Every time we come into any of those groups, we go back to the word that we are teaching currently. And we ask, how is it applicable at your level? What are you doing with it? Let's talk about this. How is this changing your life? And share with everybody else what you've done with it, so they can also build on it. So that became our process. But having said that, it still takes time, because we still had people around us who kind of want to fall into a reset. You know, the factory settings of church. So questions like, when are we going to? A reference to something that was done in church. When are we going to have prayer meetings? When are we going to? In other words, you're bringing your tools from the old model and thinking, when are we going around to doing this stuff? And we literally killed a lot of that stuff, not because we don't like it, but because we knew what it would do.
Exactly.
It took a long time for me to have prayer setups. Not that we didn't pray, but because I didn't want to encourage the same old prayer meeting. Prayer for us became a specific dynamic with outcome. It had to be measurable. It had to be tangible. We need to see the prayer and the answer. So we had to journey people. Remember the pendulum effect? We had to come to the middle, where we are still doing it, but when we say prayer, you can be sure we're not talking about what you have in mind. When we say any of the terms that are familiar, we don't mean what you think we're saying. So it took a while to get that out of people, because it's hard, if you've been programmed for years, to think that if I come into a kingdom setting, the usual activity is not there. Because your mind says, we've come to a kingdom activity, let's open with prayer, let's ask somebody to do this, and then I just simply didn't do that. It was very disorienting, but it was necessary. And
well, because what you're doing is you're requiring people to be conscious, because one of the ways I liken it to, and it's something we did in our community, but it took over a few years to do it, was move from, having a timetable defined for us to creating our own timetable.
Yes.
That was reflective of the outcomes that we want to see.
There you go.
And that's not an easy feat, like you said, because people carry what they know. And so even their new ideas are still old ideas.
Yes.
Because unless they've changed frequency, there's essentially going to be saying what is old, but just speaking of it as if it's new.
Yes.
And so you have to be, like you said, you have to begin to question everything. And you have the key thing for me was always, how does that contribute to where we're going? Because if it's not contributing to where we're going, then it has no place until you can show that how it's going to contribute and convince others that it is going to contribute.
Yes. And that become very necessary. And we're still doing it.
Yeah.
We're still doing it because it's not easy to weed out patterns that have been there for years and years and years. I know there was a season I had a level of leadership around me that I had to disband because they were forming back into the old eldership. They were not seeing themselves as manifestation points of the truths we shared. They were seeing themselves as leaders of the others.
Yeah.
Again, back to the old model. They were building the old ranking, man of God, senior leaders, others below, scenario again. And they didn't understand that the demand was on them being closer in terms of conversation
or proximity,
and proximity, therefore able to articulate and model better than everybody else. And so I had to become very careful about even the term leader. Everything suddenly matters. When you call somebody anything, you have to define what you mean by that term, because then they fall immediately into the default of the old model.
Yeah, one of the things we've done in the last year or so, we're a small community, but we stripped down the typical understandings that we had of rank and role. And one of the things that has emerged from it is a layer called, I wouldn't even call it a layer really, but this idea of civic leadership. It's sometimes it's roles that emerge that are for the sake of driving civic responsibilities forward and shaping them. I find that to be more fitting, because what it does is it requires a person to think beyond the traditional lines of deacon and elder.
Yes.
So a person may be an elder, they may be a deacon, but they're actually within the context of a civic role, a civic responsibility, which is always keeping them connected to that wider national vision. And given that, and from that, we're trying to develop competencies that sit with that are measurable, and that we could hopefully then flow through the rest of the camp, as it were, and develop and grow. But it's very interesting, because on one side it feels very different in terms of the way that it's shaped, and on the other side, nonetheless, it still has those core elements within it that are necessary. We're not departing theologically. I always say that it's interesting that Jesus' theology is perfect, ours isn't. And we've got to accept that there's a development, there has to be a development in our theology. And in some cases, what you're often dealing with people transitioning from membership to citizenship is it's undeveloped theology.
Yes.
Their scope of theology is so limited to their parish, to their denomination, to their ministry, that the challenges of its limitation manifest when you ask them to go outside of that limitation, or you're requiring them to think or use language outside of it.
Yes.
And so that's where often people pull back to the safe space, the place which is more comfortable to them, which is in terms of what they know.
And I think one of the challenges is what I call the curse of permanence, where we are so built into, when a position is created, it should exist for the sake of existing, as opposed to it should exist for a reason.
Yeah.
And when the reason is no longer available, it becomes unnecessary. But the issue is how to manage the emotional attachment to that particular positioning. And people getting a sense of demotion when there wasn't an elevation.
Exactly.
That still will be a challenge for a while because of our programming, our Babylonian programming, and so on. And so I had to introduce the concept of scaffolding. I said, scaffolding is only required until the building stands.
Yeah, I've introduced the same concept.
Yes. The minute the building stands, the scaffolding has no value.
Yeah.
And we should learn to be permanent scaffolds. Never really worried about. The more important thing is that I achieved getting the building up.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now I need to be a scaffolding elsewhere. The Noah principle, the ark is not as important as the cargo. Well, once we get the cargo, we don't need the ark. But
on the flip side, I've used scaffolding in the context of the church being the scaffolding that has ended up hiding the kingdom.
Exactly.
Because
has cemented itself.
It's cemented itself.
It no longer wants to be removed. The mold won't go away.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I guess for me, you talk about some of the challenges there's more of that to me than anything else. The mentality and the desire for settlement.
Yeah.
And like we always say that every time we have settlement, we're going to have a tower. That's the biggest worry. That when you have settlement, we're going to build a tower, and then we're headed off in the wrong direction. We're no longer doing what we're supposed to be doing. And so we've had to get people get used to change. Now, dealing in a world system that requires longevity and permanence for the sake of longevity and permanence, people tend to get the feeling we have a leader who is not stable.
Yeah.
Doesn't seem to settle on any particular issue. We should just rest on this and let this. I mean, if it's working, why don't we just stick with it? You don't get it. The idea wasn't to get it working. It was working so that we could move to another dynamic. And I guess, and I also think it's also contextual. It's contextual because of nature and nurture. There's a way people in the African context are nurtured. The people in different places are nurtured. And so sometimes what I apply, so people will come up and say, but how do you do this? And I say, it doesn't really matter because it might not apply in your context. Yeah, there's people with different.
Also, I would also say as well, it's interesting that within, I come from a background of agile project management. So I've developed a sense and become clear about the flexibility of doing things, trialing them, failing fast. You know, the idea that it's actually okay to try something out. If it doesn't work, we'll move on to something else.
Yes.
And that again is a very different way of applying things within the context. You can't do that within a church.
Yes.
You can't fail.
Church loves history. And then
exactly. And so as a result, its lack of movement and its rigidity is driven by the fact that rather than focusing on outcomes, it's focusing on outputs. And so when you hear people talking about, they come out of a service and they talk about the fact of those familiar things, God moved because those familiar things were fixed.
Yes.
And then when you ask them, well, what was it that God did or moved? And they're speaking all about the outputs, not about the outcomes in their life, which questions whether God did anything, frankly, from half the time. then actually you realize that one of the things about, I'm very careful to say not church to ecclesia. I say it, but one of my concerns is I don't see the ecclesia as a title or a label. I see it as a functional, operational system that is evolved from a community that that essentially manifests governance. Yes. And so because of that, I think that it has to fail forward. It has to be willing to change and be flexible and be outcomes focused rather than output focused.
Yes. It's good you raise that, because if we talk about the current Ekklesia discussion, recently I began to get this misgiving, and I'll explain why. Because much like, if you remember the season you spoke about, when suddenly everyone was becoming an apostle, right? We even had people ordaining apostles. Stuff that you cannot put your finger on. Where from suddenly we are rebanding everything back in and taking the old model, trying to churn out a new product with the old model. So in the same manner, initially when we began these conversations on Ekklesia, I remember when Andy and I began some of these conversations. I did have a conference in Nairobi. I had him come in, and the topic was from church to ecclesia and so on. I remember those early days, and a lot of the things that were happening is that we sounded like these weird, odd guys who got all this, and a lot of people cut it down to English. Said, look, call it what you want, it's the church.
Yeah, semantics.
Yes, they thought that's what we were saying.
Yeah.
They thought our big problem was what to call it. Nobody actually understood that we're talking about a new entity that has nothing to do with the present entity. People simply thought, and that's why we said church to ecclesia, to distinguish two different positions completely, not a new name for church.
And Tim had the same experience. I had the same experience talking to people.
There you go. Now, My concern is that now, just like the season of the apostles, now everybody wants ecclesia.
Yeah.
And now that's scary because we're going to have brands of ecclesia that have nothing to do with ecclesia. Just like the way the term kingdom has to be quantified now. When people say that they are a kingdom community, we need to understand whether they are branding Christianity kingdom,
Yeah.
branding church ecclesia, because it's the trending word. It's the buzzword. It sounds good in the mouth now. It's no longer a problem, And so many, it's almost like the Counter-Reformation,
Yeah. Yeah.
in the days of Martin Luther, where the Catholic Church found a way around it to maintain status quo.
Yeah. Yeah.
by accepting certain aspects just to whitewash the activity. And my concern is soon we will have to distinguish the ecclesia from the ecclesia.
Yeah.
And not really the church and the ecclesia anymore. I think to me, that is really the new worry. So it means we have to move away from just the term to actual definitions, practical definitions that can be measured up to. When we say an ecclesia community, what parameters are we putting in place that would distinguish it from church? I think that's critical.
Thank you for joining our fireside talk about the kingdom. My name is Frederick Tobun, and I hope this podcast has been a blessing to you. If you'd like to continue to receive fresh insight into the kingdom, click the notification bell to follow us. For further information about the kingdom, visit our website www.unlockthekingdomwithinyou.com to download your free ebook. See you soon.